Madison agronomy department for a couple of years before heading to West Virginia for graduate school, where he earned his MS and PhD in forest resource science and fisheries ecology and management. Since then, he spent a couple of years in Oklahoma and then southeastern Wisconsin before moving to La Crosse, where he's a lecturer in biology at the university. He's active in Trout Unlimited, including the local chapter in La Crosse, the Cooley Region chapter, and his interests are stream ecology, fish habitat interactions, and landscape watershed influences on streams and their habitats. He also writes a blog, which is mostly about fishing in the Driftless, which he started during COVID, called The Scientific Fly Angler. And you can find it at www.scientificflyangler.com.
Cool, thank you. Thank you, I appreciate it. I always find it a good excuse to come to Baroqua, so I don't mind driving from La Crosse at all. So I'm going to kind of get into this a little bit. So here is the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. I do some stuff with Trout Unlimited in Wisconsin. We are, and then with Cooley Region, that's our local chapter here, which we will be over at Gasser's the third Wednesday of this month, by the way. So those of you who are interested. This is, when I put this talk together, this was the last blog post I'd written. It was just kind of a, you guys all remember COVID and kind of, yeah, I'm sure. So I was looking for something else to do because I got a little, I don't know, I got a little stir crazy. So, yeah, teaching online was not a lot of fun, so I found other things to do. So a little outline of what I'm going to talk about today is we're going to talk a little bit about climate change, kind of present some data around climate change, talk a little bit about flooding, which we've seen a lot of around here. I mean, it's something we've had for decades upon decades. We'll have it with this topography anyways. Talk kind of how those two things interact in our landscape here in the Driftless and the changes we've seen to the Driftless. And then being a fish person, the last thing to talk a little bit about is this idea of stream manipulation, as I'll call it. I mean, we talk about it as restoration or improvements or manipulation. I kind of like the word manipulation as it's a little bit, the connotation is kind of vague. Because oftentimes, we'll talk about this, is we don't really restore streams very often. It's hard to do in this area. So a little bit about climate change. Thank you. A little bit about climate changes. We are milder in the winter, although we have some of these weird temperature anomaly things. And our summers have been quite a bit warmer, especially as you've probably recognized these last couple of years. We've had water temperature issues in early June the last couple of years now. We've had some 90-degree heat happen kind of those first week or so in June, and we've had some issues there. We've also been wetter, so these are data from the West Fork watershed, Crosse and the fisheries biologists there. So we've seen an increase in base flow. We've seen basically higher minimums, higher maximums, and that has pretty well gone along with our higher precipitation that we've received. So we're seeing some changes just due to the fact that we've been wetter. And of course, the thing I'm going to talk a little bit about is there is a good possibility for a greater frequency and magnitude of flood events. And as we start looking at the data, you'll see that's definitely been pretty true around here. So, talking about climate change, if you look at these where they give you points to talk from, so from La Crosse, the kind of projections for 2060 puts us, or in 60 years, or 2080, sorry, puts us kind of in the eastern part of Kansas, the western part of Missouri, in terms of being quite a bit warmer, also being a little bit wetter. And if we look at our temperatures, we have seen that our average or annual Tmax, so the high temperature has gone up by about 2 degrees where we're at, a little bit warmer in other parts of Wisconsin. What's maybe even more interesting, I think, is that the minimum temperature has actually gone up a little bit too. So that is we have had essentially, and you kind of seen this some of the summers, we've had warmer nights in the summer, which is what we kind of see there. And we see, this is probably the one I hate the most. I do not deal well with warm temperatures. Those 2 years in Oklahoma were really rough. A lot more warm temperatures. So the likelihood of getting above 90 degrees Fahrenheit for a temperature is going to continue to increase. We've seen some increases there as well. And of course precipitation changes, so we are a little, well, quite significantly, not a little bit, I'd say fairly significantly wetter, so 20% or more precipitation in a year, which is pretty significant. And we are getting at least more of that, it seems, happens in the summer. And that is probably because when you get a massive rainstorm, that really changes your average quite significantly. That's probably what drives a lot of that. You will notice in northern Wisconsin, kind of interesting that, and we saw that this year for sure, they were a lot drier in the summer, but they, even though their precipitation's gone up as well, it's just not happening June, July, and August like it is here. And then these are kind of a series of rainfall things, looking at historic data, how often we had greater than 2-inch rainfalls in a year, or sorry, in a decade, and then looking at it in the future and expecting that to happen much more frequently. And those are the ones that are probably going to lead to more significant flooding, or the 2+, but especially if you go to the 5+ inch rainfalls, we are expected to see a pretty significant increase, like at least, another couple per decade. We're going to talk about 2018 in particular a little bit, as it was a real outlier. If you were around for 2018, so where I'm going to talk a fair bit about is essentially La Crosse, Monroe, Vernon counties come together. One of my favorite fishing places, I'm not giving away any secrets here, is the Coon Creek system is right through there. So Bohemian Valley and Rulis Coulee and Timber Coulee, Coon Creek all kind of come together in that area, and it goes between the counties a little bit. Well, that was exactly the area that got hit with really large rainfall. Up to nearly 20 inches, which is just a monumental rainfall that happened overnight. We had dam failures, we had flooding on the West Fork and Coon Creek, because essentially the line here delineates to the West Fork and to the Coon Creek watershed. So really, really significant, hopefully once in a lifetime rainfalls. There are, of course, no guarantees of that. And if we look at historic flooding, this is one I really find interesting. That one, you're going to see some other numbers elsewhere. When we actually, the USGS ran the numbers, they found out that one peaked at almost 19.5 feet. And they were thinking it was going to hit maybe 16.5, and it ended up being 3 feet higher, which is a lot of water. It is the largest flood on record. It is this dot right there. So that is the largest. And if we look at kind of the most significant floods, 4 out of the top 6 have been in these last, like, since 2007 or so. So pretty significant flooding increases that have happened, and especially again this 2018 one, which was a pretty massive outlier. But certainly, I know people that talk about the big floods in the 60s and 70s. I'm sure some of you have probably witnessed some of those. And this was quite a bit bigger in most places. And this, because we have, the way that the gauging stations work. This is from Lafarge on the Kickapoo River. I use this one because we have a lot of data on it. It goes back a long ways, so we get a pretty good record. We don't have gauges on the West Fork and on Coon Creek that have that kind of data, so we don't know exactly what, I'm sure somebody has figured out exactly where it hit based on looking at where the flood debris got to. But those are probably the most significant floods either one of those watersheds have ever seen. Being a person who spent 30 years or better coming and fishing the West Fork, I would come back from grad school and fish the West Fork. that it's something that's always been prone to flooding. This was even larger. So again, this one we thought was going to hit about 16 feet, which would have made it a record. Instead, it was closer to 20. So really significant flood, and if you remember that flood event, this was not, so this is what they had, this is what before the gauge basically gave out. This is what we predicted to happen, so this is from the USGS. This is what they predicted. What actually happened is we got that rainfall and ended up peaking at about 20, and then instead of this falling limb being sort of gentle like that, we got another pretty significant rainfall on the already wet saturated ground, and we kind of got like another flood on top of that. And we had dam failures, like this is Jersey Valley, which is now a little bit less than half of its original size, certainly much less of its depth. So when this gave way through here, we had a pretty significant flood downstream. One of the places I always dearly love is the West Fork Sports Club in Avalanche. I've been coming there for many, many, many years. The little blue cabin that used to be there was there forever and ever and ever. It was one of the things that, it was one of the casualties of the flood. We had water that was about almost 3 feet deep inside of the clubhouse on there. I got to run my chainsaw inside the clubhouse. That was a really interesting one. And since things have been fixed up really well, and hopefully we just don't see another one of these floods. But of course, again, there are no guarantees on things like this. And so we had that dam give way. We had a dam on Knapp Creek as well give way. We had several dams in the Coon Creek watershed as well give way. So we've seen 14 dams fail in the last decade. 8 of those were in 2018. So 2018 was a pretty significant year for dam failures. And it's not just here, meaning it's not just here in the Driftless, but this is from southeast Wisconsin, highway being closed down. This is talking about repetitive floods in other places. This is a story from the Mississippi. You wouldn't tell it from this year. We're pretty low this year on the Mississippi, but they've had some pretty, last year or 2 years ago was the highest we've ever had to sustain water levels on the Mississippi, so things change pretty quickly. Waukesha area, the I-94 getting closed down. Climate change in Pakistan, huge floods there this year. Flooding, still missing a bridge in between Wisconsin and Minnesota, so these things are kind of happening everywhere, and they add up to pretty significant dollar amounts. I mean, we'll talk about the one here in this area, talking about pretty close to $250 million in damage. And it is a pretty significant amount of money that is spent fixing up dams, or fixing up from floods, and part of that's the dams, but it's other things as well. So, you have all seen images like this before. This is just kind of a driftless area map. I always like these ones that show the relief really well. There's always some pretty cool things on here, like Military Ridge, this Cuesta, where it slopes really fast on one side and much more gently on the other side, which is, if you start looking at why things are where they are, trout streams and all that, that explains a lot of it. We get here, the Kickapoo River watershed in particular really stands out. We'll talk about that one in a little bit of detail through some other images. So this is unglaciated, rugged topography, so we're going to be somewhat flood prone because we have steep slopes. You get 18 inches of water falling on it, and there's not a ton that you can do, but we can build in some resiliency is kind of what I'll talk a little bit about later. And we have a erosional landscape. That is our coulees. These valleys have been carved by water for millions and millions of years, where if you go anywhere else in the state, it's a relatively new landscape. Talking about what's there has only been there for about 10,000 years. So water is just starting to kind of make some progress in moving stuff there. We're here, we've been shaped by water for a long, long time. These are always, I think, fun. So this is one of so talking about blog posts, this is one of the most fun ones I ever wrote, looking into kind of what the Driftless looked like at one point in time. So going back to things like these early vegetation maps that the University of Wisconsin's made a couple of different versions of at different times. I think one of the important things to understand is we always hear people talk about how the driftless area was prairie, or we hear it was savanna, and it's true, but we have really significant areas of mesic, wet forest. So especially, as best I can tell from these maps, and best I've looked into it, is essentially the Kickapoo River was sort of a break where to the east of it we had these sugar maple, basswood, elm, wetter forest, where other side of the Kickapoo, so that the main stem of the Kickapoo, we had more savannas, more of bur oak, white oak, and then grasses, right? So our warm season grasses. So we had more. We certainly did have a lot more prairie and savanna habitat. The thing with agriculture is, of course, the easiest thing to turn into farmland is stuff that has fewer trees on it, or no trees. So we see that kind of everywhere, that you look at a map of what habitats are still in the state, we have a lot less prairie everywhere. Like when I was at Platteville for an undergrad, we went to Ipswich Prairie. It is 18 acres. It is the largest wet prairie native in Wisconsin. 18 acres, that's it, right? And as I talked about, the eastern side of the Kickapoo is different. Also then going into Richland County, so I'm thinking possibly a fire break or something like that is kind of one of the predictions of why that happened. Because I do think it's also kind of important to understand is that we think that a lot of this savanna in particular was probably Native Americans keeping it as savanna by burning it once in a while. So it wasn't as if it was not some human influence on the landscape. So these are just kind of fun. This is from a paper fairly recent, looking at kind of the structure of forests, and again, just kind of to show this, what really stands out is this sort of eastern Kickapoo area in Richland County, and then in the northern Driftless, we have another kind of similar area with more closed forest, but otherwise, we had some kind of open woodland. I forget exactly the numbers of trees they put on this, but to savanna, usually we're talking about 18 to 20 trees per acre or fewer. So, so relatively spread out, relatively sparse trees, typically white oaks and bur oaks around here. And then this same paper, just now a little bit finer resolution, a little bit finer scale. Again, the sugar maples, the blue shows up in the Kickapoo a little bit. We also pick up a little bit more of some of the white oaks and bur oaks kind of west, so Minnesota in particular gets a little bit less precipitation, so they get trees that reflect that a little bit better. Something about this area probably got a little bit more precipitation, probably has to do with the topography, maybe also had to do with them not burning these areas. We also see to some degree a little bit more elm, a little bit more black oak as well, a little bit more water tolerant things. And this is the one I really like. I know it's hard to see any of this from anywhere, so I will kind of talk through the things I think are interesting here. First, we were definitely oak dominated, right? So bur, white, and black oaks were really common just about everywhere, with the exception especially of that kind of part of the Kickapoo and that part of the northern Driftless, where we see more sugar maple. So sugar maple up the third one from the left, up at the top. We also see a little bit more basswood and a little bit more elm in those places. What I would think is also important, this is the one I really like to point out, is box elder is sort of the tree that we associate with riparian zones a lot of times now. There is very little evidence there is much box elder anywhere. So these are from pollen records and from witness trees, kind of they combine those two things, and they just didn't find box elders. Also didn't find a lot of willows. And to me, the trees, like if you're gonna find witness trees, the thing that's really gonna stand out is those trees that are out in the open, right? Those are the ones that we're especially gonna see. And we're not picking up box elders, we're not picking up willows, wherever that was on here, black willows here. We pick them up mostly, those trees that tend to like the wet a little bit more, we pick them up in the Mississippi River Valley, which of course would have been a much, much different thing before the dams too. We greatly changed those. And the smattering of other, that becomes really important because as we start looking at the changes, we're going to see that we've been losing the oaks, we've been replacing them with others. So some of this is forest clearing, certainly. So this is looking pre-settlement to an earlier study in the 90s to a more current one in the kind of 2006 to 2010. So this paper looking at what trees were dominant here in the Midwest driftless, seeing a large decline in the oaks, a bit of an increase in the maple basswood. Probably has something to do with greater precipitation. That's probably going to drive at least part of that. Then this other category got big, right? So other eastern softwoods got large, cottonwoods increased, hickory increased a little bit, ash had increased a little bit. That's certainly gone away, or is going away. And then the other has grown quite significantly, right? So we've kind of seen the shift from oaks to others, from species that live in drier climates to species that live in wetter climates, and we see that with the precipitation. So mesic forests, so that is relatively wet forests, are increasing. Our xeric forests, our drier forests, have been on the decline. Again, probably just mostly precipitation. And probably removal of fires had a big impact on this as well. Some of the oaks much more fire tolerant. Now without fire on the landscape, we don't get rid of their competitors, and those things grow where the oaks no longer have that fire to kind of drive their competitors away.
So how does the sloping affect, whether it's a south facing or north, does it,
It probably has a pretty big effect locally. Like I think that's probably part of what drives that part of the Kickapoo Valley that's wetter is probably the direction that those slopes face. So especially where you have north facing slopes, you're going to get wetter forests. Like I know in the Crosse, I always point this out to my students, those south facing slopes on the bluffs, that's kind of the places we get those goat prairies, and that's kind of the only places around us that aren't forested when you look at the bluffs. Good question. Here it just kind of shows this again. So we look at the top being the mid-80s, the 1990s, then kind of the early 2000s. We see this big shift from oak to other, essentially, is kind of the thing that drives this. You also kind of see this thing that they broke out, which is the Kickapoo in Richland County, and to all the way, this actually goes all the way to that little point there is the Devil's Lake area, that kind of eastern edge of it. That area was a lot different. And I think the thing that we end up seeing is this idea we talk a lot about in biology, this homogenization, where instead of there being some variance across the landscape, everything's essentially become more similar. Right? And that's kind of one of the things that we see pretty regularly. And part of it is certainly landscape changes as well that's driven this. So this, if you really want to get down a rabbit hole and spend some time, search for Wisconsin Historical Aerial Imagery Finder, and you can find all kinds of stuff. So this, just to orient you a little bit, this is Snowflake. So this is Upper Timber Coulee. So right about here is Snowflake. And I think, we see some kind of important things on here. One, we see a lot more forest now than we did from this image, which was late 1930s. So forests have increased. So we kind of cleared everything, and now it's coming back. And the other thing I see is, I always think this one's really interesting. If you look at this, so some of these fields here, which were some of the first contours done, so we're talking about late 1930s, that would have started kind of early 1930s, the contouring. We look at more recent maps, some of those contours have kind of gone away, so our fields have gotten bigger to accommodate bigger pieces of equipment, and kind of the efficiency part, but maybe not holding soil as well as they used to when they were contouring, I wonder. And then just out of curiosity, here's Roca 1939. So take a look at these sometime if you just want to go down a rabbit hole and find some kind of cool stuff. Go and look at what areas used to look like compared to now, and you can see if you overlaid, and especially when you go to the map, you click on a little button and it shows you what the aerial image looks like overlaid over what's there today. And Crosse goes a whole lot farther north than it used to. An increase in about 1,000, 1,200 people or something like that as well, like that. And then another, to talk a little bit about today, egg-dominated landscape. If we look historically, so here we're mid-1800s to the 1930s, so when those aerial photos were taken, it was kind of the late 1930s. And then to the 1990s, and we see kind of, I would say kind of interesting, is we had all of this area that was savanna and prairie. Basically anything that was savanna or prairie became agriculture because it was easy. We see this Kickapoo Valley and to the south and east of it still stand out pretty well. And it kind of goes away a little bit in these more recent ones, right? It's coming back to some degree. We're a little bit more forested, but it doesn't stand out like it used to, where now the forests are in other parts of this landscape more significantly when they didn't seem to used to be. I think that was just kind of a cool little thing from that. And again, just our landscape has changed from one of grasslands with sparse trees to one of agriculture largely. Although some of that agriculture has gone away between those two images, there was more agricultural land in some ways in the 1930s than there is now because we found out we were farming a lot of places that weren't very good places to farm. So historical agriculture, I was think I drove by it today, I look at it every single time I go by, the sign for America's first watershed project just to the north side of Coon Valley. So Ella Leopold was here. I think that's always kind of cool. I went to the shack this year. It was like a pilgrimage. It was about the coolest thing ever. If you ever get a chance to go. It is pretty amazing. Yeah. I even had like an hour to myself before anyone else went there, so I just kind of got to hang out and meditate more or less. It was pretty awesome. So this farming pretty ill-suited, this historic farming without kind of any consideration for topography led to the big issues I'm going to talk about here in the last part of this. So we implemented contour farming. This was the Soil Conservation Service, today's NRCS. We made some pretty amazing strides. As I start showing, how many people have seen this image before, right? I think it's required if you give a talk about the driftless to have this was the Mondovi area, as I understand. See the guy on the horse there. Think about how many guys on horses of gully there are there. It was pretty amazing what we did to this landscape, and I think a lot of people just kind of don't recognize how much we have changed this place.
What's the story behind the picture? I'm not familiar with that.
This is an NRCS image that is essentially, they're talking about gully erosion. So there's a guy on a horse there, and this image gets shown everywhere because this essentially, you can kind of tell right here, was probably where the land used to be. This is all soil that was from the upland that got deposited. And then it dug even deeper, and I'll talk about why in a second here. So we dug our streams down. Now we're kind of in the process of our streams are building back up, or what we call it grading. And our streams are actually higher than they used to be now after this had happened. So real kind of there's this kind of balance between sediments and water and how much sediments water can move. And this kind of gets into showing that a little bit. I'm going to talk about, so valley sedimentation is this darker line, and we see that especially 1900 to 1930 was kind of the worst of it. So sort of pre-Dust Bowl was the worst of it, where we were losing massive amounts of sediment and they were getting deposited in the valleys. So our valleys, we lifted them up by having this soil that used to be on the hillsides, made its way down in the valleys. This other line is essentially looking at the erosion then, and you notice that that is a little bit, it lags behind a little bit. So this, by the 1970s, around when this paper was done, so this was an 82 paper, that it hadn't gotten back to where it was, even though the sediment being delivered to the valleys had. Which is what I think kind of the big take-home message there was, is that that lagged a little bit behind, and we're still seeing more erosion than we saw historically. And these are Trimble images. So this is probably one of the, so fluvial geomorphology, thinking about how water moves stuff. some of the kind of most important papers between Trumbull and Knox, folks at UCLA, Trumbull, and at Wisconsin, Jim Knox, looking at essentially what happened to sediment. And if you look at this first image, we see this massive number of essentially upland stuff that was on the hills that got moved into the valleys. And what I think is really interesting is if you look at how much of it is efflux, that is sediment that's moved to the Mississippi River, that number really hasn't changed in, 150-ish years. We really haven't changed that number, but what we really have changed is we stored a whole bunch of it in the valleys. What we're seeing today is that sediment that's in the valleys, at the stream banks especially, is the sediment that's getting moved downstream. So today, about that same number makes its way to the Mississippi, but most of it's coming out of these stream banks that have been basically built up because of all the sediment from the hillsides that have been deposited in our valleys.
That tends to be the organic, good stuff.
Yes, it was the good stuff,
It
yes.
gets moved downstream.
Yes, so we talked, I'm not going to get into it in here for this talk, but wanting to reduce nitrogen and phosphorus delivery, one of the best ways to do it is make it so those banks can't get eroded. We'd save a ton of nitrogen and phosphorus getting into the Gulf of Mexico. And maybe if we did this in enough places, we wouldn't have quite the dead zone we have at the Gulf. But that's where a lot of that is coming from. Here's an image from Knox. This is down in Grant County, but you can basically see where the valley used to be, and everything above that is essentially deposited sediments. So we're talking in places in the Driftless 3 meters or more, 10 feet or more of sediment that was on the hillside that now fills valleys. That is not a small change. And this kind of shows what these stream valleys look like. So we had valleys that were, maybe 90 feet or so in this case. So this is actually this is a drawing from actual data. And looking at this for one particular site on the Big Platte River. So again, Knox did a lot of this stuff down in Grant County, and saw that we had a floodplain that was about 90 feet, and we would have had a little stream somewhere in there. And when that stream flooded, it went on the floodplain, and it had a ton of room to go. And it would have moved back and forth between the floodplain. Now we've deposited 10 or more feet of sediment, and now we get stream valleys or streams that are much different in those valleys. And they don't have access to that floodplain that they once did. And this is kind of the other one that we see all the time in these presentations, is talking a little bit about what pre-settlement. So we had in many, many places, we would have had much more wet valley floors. We would have had a lot of groundwater interaction. We would have had sedge meadows and such. And then that sedge meadow got covered up with alluvium. Alluvium is just a word for stuff that used to be up high is now down low. That's fine. I'm not a geologist. I'm a biologist. So it was stuff from the hillsides that made its way to the valley. And now we have these streams, instead of being able to meander through this valley, are kind of stuck in place, right? And that's kind of the issue. And now the box elders, they give way, and we get streams that get wider and wider. To restore is really, really difficult. It basically means you got to get rid of that, what we call cultural sediment. You got to get rid of all this dark stuff and move it elsewhere. So that doesn't happen too terribly often. I would say almost impossible, but I'll show you an example. And so kind of the big point of this is our streams exist in really different places than they used to be. So the valleys have been greatly, greatly modified. So this is another one of those. So again, I'm going to play the role of geologist, even though I'm mostly a biologist. I've taken enough geology to be dangerous. So we talk about stream powers, essentially, as you would think, about how streams are able to move stuff. And it's a function of the slope. So how steep it is. Steeper places can move stuff, can move bigger stuff. The volume of the water, so the discharge, which we usually talk about as cubic feet per second, or as scientists we talk about cubic meters per second, CMS. Gravity, which doesn't change. And then the density of water, which can change a little bit in floods, but really kind of the thing is the slope and the discharge. So bigger floods move bigger stuff. The same flood on a steeper piece of ground is going to be more damaging, right? It's going to have more power. And then this just kind of looks at the relationship between particle size and what it takes to move them and keep them moving, or as they start getting deposited. So this is a look at another Trimble paper from the 80s, looking at what our streams used to look like, and now with this cultural sediment, what they're starting to look like now. And what I wanted to talk about here a little bit is, so we had streams that naturally had low power. That is, they were able to really quickly get out of the bank onto the floodplain and lose that energy. Now that we put them into this unnatural setting, they gain power. So they gain the ability to do damage. So the secret to this then should be is we need to find ways to get them back onto their floodplains so they can't do as much damage. And again, just kind of one of those loss of floodplain connectivity. In this scenario, this stream takes a lot of water before it gets out of its banks, and it has a lot of power before that happens. So it's doing a lot of damage to that channel, probably cutting banks and stuff at that time, and causing pretty significant damage, whereas historically that wasn't the case. So here it is talking about restoration. Here's a really great project from the East Branch of the Pecatonica River, one of the really few examples where we basically, so this was the DNR at USGS. This is a colleague of mine, Kyle and Belby at UW Crosse, and looking at, so this was in a chapter on a book dedicated to Jim Knox, and talking about, so the work that was done in the East Branch is basically they took these trees away, they took the cultural sediment away. The hard part there is it's really expensive to move all that soil. Right? So if you've done anything with projects like we do with Trout Unlimited, one of the big costs are getting rock in and getting sediment out, because trucking costs are pretty expensive. So this was a pretty massively expensive project, but kind of a test of concept in a way. Is can we get down to where the valley floor used to be? Can we restore those wet prairies, and will our streams look like they used to? And there's really cool evidence out of this. That's what's happened. The hard part is, how do you do that with all these places across this massive area? And we probably can't, but we can find ways to, at least for parts of it, get our streams onto the floodplain a little bit faster and easier. So 2018, if you were living in this area in 2018, you remember 2018. I mean, it is just, it was amazing. This is one. It scare the hell out of you. Dave asked about the idea of, so compared to the 60s and 70s, what's happened to erosion rates? And I tried to find good data on that. I looked at RCS, I couldn't find anything. So we have seen a decrease in basically the amount of erosion off of landscapes, but that dates back, only to the 1990s. And I think, and if I, went back and showed kind of that aerial image of some of the changes in contours, I know fishing along the West Fork, I noticed that last year that there were some fields that just got bigger on the hillsides. I would not doubt that we are back in a place where we are delivering more sediment than we did historically. And I think I just can't find data on it to support it. But my gut intuition is yes, we have had a little bit of increase in sediment.
Well, one of the other secondary impacts we've seen from runoff is change. Ralph mentioned our backwaters in the Mississippi River, it's also converted on whatever we have left in the column of Vernon County to stagnant sewers. Rum Hollow, society's getting that way too.
Yeah, and I think everyone knew that when they built those dams, that was going to be problematic. I mean, that was, not to get into the whole thing, but it's why the Kickapoo Valley Reserve is there now, and because we knew that the water quality in that was not gonna be good. It's a lot more than that, of course, but, yeah, there's just a lot of sediment in the valleys that now get moved by streams, and you put a dam in place, you know, back to, oh, I know where the hell my Hillsborough diagram is. You put a dam in place, now you have slowed down the current velocity, and all of these particles deposit, right? So it's kind of why at the Mississippi River we got this big huge delta where all that fine sediment finally gets to a place where it falls out and we get that big delta. You see the same thing with the dams, right? I mean, I know, oh, this was up a few. Nope, maybe not. Yeah, let me go full view so we can see it. This is behind that image. Yeah, so if we look at Jersey Valley, you can certainly see this, you know, the kind of fans that get formed by that sediment that get delivered there. So yeah, but we kind of knew that was going to happen with those dams. Kind of hard for it not to. As an aside, we do some research stuff on Neshonoc so we stock some muskies in there, and I've gone out with grad students and tracking them. Neshonoc has lost something like 200 acres of Lake Neshonoc no longer exists or dry because of all the sediment in the Crosse River got deposited and filled in the lake. So compared to what it used to be. So they did a big dredging out there to at least make some places a little bit deeper again. But it's kind of a natural thing. You put a dam in place and you move all the sediment, it's going to fall out as soon as it can. So, Donna, I know you had a question right away, so.
Yeah, so in many of the restoration projects, we hear about them going in and planting willows.
Mm-hmm.
And you talked about the importance more of those warm season grasses with their deeper root systems. Trees don't typically have that type of deep root system. So what's the purpose behind us planting those? Is it more for faster growth?
I think that they're cheap. I would say, I'll talk about Weister Creek a little bit. That was a place I would rather see, like there, if you look at Weister, we got the cottonwoods and some other trees that are far off, so they still have the shading effect, but they don't have the effect of catching stuff in floods so much, unless the flood gets really, really high. And I think that's kind of the better way to go, is I don't see that the stream side trees are probably going to help in most places. I think having shade trees is great, and I know we're talking about a project with the DNR this year in Bohemian Valley, or upper timber, and planting some swamp white oaks and things like that, but planting them out of the floodplain a little bit, but so they're still active shade trees when they get big enough. And I think, like, again, if you go to Weister Creek, I shouldn't be giving away my favorite places, but if you go to Weister Creek and you walk along there, you'll see there's still the big cottonwoods, and we get places that have shade so we can cool the stream off, but they're not in a place that's going to catch flood debris, and that's, I think, a much better way to do it. I think that's what most places are doing. I know on our projects we've never planted willows. I think the willows come back in as the problem.
Yeah.
Then if you don't burn, if you don't mow, if you don't do something, willows will come back in. And of course with willows, as you know, if you cut them, they just keep coming back.
Maybe I'd comment on that, the Weister Creek project. The first of the 5 years, most of the work, so that's the big bulldozers and excavators and all the disturbed soil, was in mid-June at the peak of the cottonwood seed fall. So we went in and hand-planted prairie seed, and I was really concerned what we're going to get. And sure enough, the cottonwoods came up thick as dog hair, all down that stretch above 24 Valley Bridge. But then 2 years later, we burned the whole thing, and that actually suppressed all of those cottonwoods and encouraged the prairie grasses to come through. So it's expensive, it's dangerous, it takes expertise, but burning, I think, is a real important tool for managing those floodplains.
And I will say on the Neckroot property that I pointed out a couple of times, so where Spring Coulee comes into Coon Creek here, I drove by when they were burning it a year ago, so they burn that pretty regularly to maintain it. And I think the fire on the landscape thing is gonna be something that we need to use.
So you had a picture of Jersey Valley Dam up there. What would happen if you just took those dams out on all these streams?
Oh God, don't get me started.
Go for it.
Nothing would happen. We, as a matter of fact, know that Jersey Valley is not made to be a flood control dam. It does not have enough head to it to do anything about floods. The talk about putting a new dam in 500 feet down below is for recreation. And they've said that's what it's for. It is not a flood, these are not flood control structures. They don't have so my perspective, living in West Virginia, the Gauley River, they take Summersville Lake, and 5 weekends in the year, in the fall, they lower it by 20 feet each weekend. So they lower it by 100 feet, and then they have this big, huge whitewater rafting that's class 5 down below it. It's amazing. And they've got flood control because they've got 100 feet of a reservoir that can get filled up. We just don't have that here, and we won't. We just don't have space for that.
But as soon as you put a dam in, you're asking for sediment to settle out.
Yeah.
You know, it's out of trouble.
Yep, all dams eventually fill in, right? If you've seen the stuff from the Elwha River out in Washington, Oregon, I forget, Washington, thank you. I was never second guess yourself, right? I tell my students that all the time. That they had all this sediment behind it. It kind of, once we took the dam out and we did it slowly enough, it's back to a pretty amazing place. We got salmon there again. That's pretty cool.
What about a comparison between a dam like Jersey Valley and a dry dam, where you just have a culvert holding it back? Which one would you prefer?
So the dry dams, I think, probably they were designed for flood, so they're gonna have hopefully a better impact. We do know that even some of those, so of those 8 dams that gave way, a couple of them were those dry dams that eventually, especially if we don't do the maintenance, and they get plugged up and then they went over the top or they went underneath. I know I've heard C's Dam is leaking, it's been leaking for a long time, so I think that we have a lot of these dams in the landscape that aren't really serving a flood control form, and if they do, unless we've had the maintenance keep up on them, they may not be helping as much as we would like them to. But I know Upper Bohemian, I think that the dam or two that broke, Upper Ruins had a dam or two that broke as well. But you get 18 inches of rain, can't do that much about it. So there's that.
Is there a succession, an expected succession of oak species as things warm up here? I know there's a website that talks about it in Southwest Wisconsin, should be putting any more pin oak now that are not very prevalent, or are there predictions or?
You're asking the wrong person. I handle the fish.
Okay.
I just know about the plants a little bit. But yes, I think if you look historically, I don't even know where that is anymore. But if you look historically, there were places we had pin oaks, and oops, I think I'm going the wrong way. There were places that historically would have had so northern pin oak probably down here, kind of that area. So we did have places that had those naturally. They, like you said, though, they were never very common, at least not regionally. But yeah, maybe that is the answer, that some of the oaks that are a little bit more water tolerant are the oaks we need because we have gotten wetter.
Just an observation that I've been marking the floodwaters on the West Fork, and I have flagged for 2018 floods.
Mm-hmm.
And in August 21, we had a flashy little thing where after all those dams were already gone, it got to the same level. It's just that it was back down 8 hours later, back in the banks. It was so flashy, and I know the West Fork is said to be flashy, but I'm really curious. That was only 6-7 inches upstream that we got, and it got to the same point that, you know, 19 inches got us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I used to look at stream habitats in the southern US, and one of the big indicators we looked at there of stream habitat quality was the amount of canopy cover over the stream from trees, because it, you know, keeps the water cool. But I was wondering, in this area where, you know, there's so much, because historically would have been so much grassland, is that still a good indicator of habitat conditions in the stream, or is it something else?
No, I think it still is, and I think, so, God, going way back to mentioning, I worked in the agronomy department, like first job out of college, before I went to grad school. We did grazing studies in southwest Wisconsin, and there we had a lot of streams that were, so we picked at least some through these rotational graze pastures, so we had some warm season grasses. And there, because of the tall warm season grasses and the relatively narrow channels, the grasses basically served as a shade. So I think that does happen in some places. If you get the nice tall warm season grasses and a narrow creek channel, that they have a pretty big effect on shading.
I always understood that spring-fed things kept things cooler too versus runoff.
They do, yes.
And
they
so
do.
how, has that changed over time, or is that is that a major effect?
It's had some effect. I think one of the big things we've seen is, no, there it is. That we've actually, so I think one of the kind of interesting things we've seen is in our base flow levels, so if you kind of go between those two and think about interpolating, our streams, so especially the minimal one, so this is the one that has the minimum flow, our base flows have been higher because of the precipitation we've had. Our groundwater's been relatively high, so our streams have done a pretty good job of staying cool, except I think we've had some warm temperatures, especially like I said, early June. We don't have a ton of vegetation shading in early June. That probably leads to a little bit warmer temps. So the last couple of years, I know some of the warmest temperatures we've had have actually been in early June rather than in August when you'd expect them.
What happened to the native grass?
We replaced it with cool season grasses, so like talking about Bohemian or somewhere like that, we tended to think that the forage quality is better on the cool season grasses. The cows digest it better. So we've largely replaced with those warm season grasses with cool season grasses instead. There are some people doing some of the rotational grazing there. Oftentimes in that you'll have some of the warm season grasses. So they'll restore prairies because then you have something kind of late into the year that you can continue to graze a little bit better.
Do you know any of the varieties and what the native grass was?
So around here, I mean, again, I'm not a botanist, but certainly switchgrass and big blue stem, Indian grass, and those kind of things would have been really common in this area, I'm sure. And then I think as you get into the places that would have been wetter, we'd have had more sedges. Right? We'd have had plants that were obligate wetland plants.
With the base flows increasing, delivering 49-degree water to the systems, is that going to counteract some of the impacts you might have by a temperature change?
I think it has a little bit. And I do think, like, you know, just again, anecdotal, don't really have data. I started coming up and fishing, somewhere kind of 95-ish, maybe a little bit earlier, maybe 91-ish. And I know the West Fork got too warm more often then than it does now. Not that it still doesn't have issues, but. And then 2018 kind of shifted things again because now there's some pretty big wide spots that warm up a little bit more, and that's not helped. I know we're trying to do a project on the West Fork kind of from, basically from the P Bridge down to Bloomingdale, down to the Bloomingdale Bridge, the one also on P, but it's just been slow to go because it has to get a whole hydrology study and that is expensive, and nobody's gonna wanna pay for it. So that's kind of what's happening there right now, unfortunately.
So being a trout fisherman, that's what you are?
I am.
How has the 2018 flood affected your success rate?
Honestly, hasn't affected it at all. I think that we think like a flood's going to have this huge damaging effect on trout populations. I've seen no impact. This was the best year of grasshopper fishing I have ever had because we didn't get the big flood. They didn't get washed out. I caught a ridiculous number of fish on grasshoppers this year.
So what do those little trout do when they get 20 feet of water?
They hunker down. They find little tiny places and they ride it out. I mean, some of them get killed, but honestly, put this nicely, but we have in many of our streams, we have too many fish. And if we lose 1,000 fish per mile on Timber Coulee, well, we've still got 2 or 3, maybe 4,000 fish per mile left behind, so it just gives them more room to grow.
So will there be a point where the temperatures in the stream get too hot for the trout to survive? Or?
Yes, there's certainly, I do think the thing that we don't maybe understand is that trout are not that stupid. They find cold water, so as long as we have tributaries that are connected, I know I don't have that image on here, but I have it somewhere on my computer. Kirk Olson sent me a thing where they tagged a fish in Elk Creek, which is a Kickapoo River tributary, Richland County, and they recaught it in Warner Creek, 31 and a half miles away. That same fish like a year later. So those fish, so long as they have watershed that they can move through during part of the year, they will find a way. They are pretty darn resilient.
They're also helped by the fact that the spring water coming in is a great moderator, and that's not going to go away easily.
Right.
Unless you start messing with the ground, I mean the water table, you're pumping water out.
Right, and that is possibly one of the things to look for. I did want to say on your question, one thing on that is, I think one of the big issues we have with these floods being fairly regular is they tend to have an effect on the really young fish. So it depends when the floods happen, and the smaller fishes are much less likely to make it through a flood. So if we have flood after flood after flood, then you have to start worrying about losing significant parts of year classes after year class after year class. And that's pretty significant worry. Like if we had 2 or 3 big floods in a row, then yeah, we're probably going to see some impacts, but we really haven't so far.
So I haven't lived here very long, and my experience where in other places I've lived is generally floods are in the spring. And I know the bad one was in August. When do the floods here tend to occur?
Whenever they
all the time. So we do certainly get the spring floods, but typically our most significant rainfalls are July and August because the energy. Kind of think of it like a hurricane, right? That we need that sun energy to for evaporation. That's going to drive the floods. So that's when we tend to get our biggest ones. Although we've had it at other times of the year too. I know there was a really little in geography, but 2017 October there was one that hit along the Great River Road there that was pretty darn significant, where they got 12 inches or something like that over a fairly small area, and it did some pretty significant damage. So, and you don't expect them in October, but climate change is kind of messing with that too, a little bit. I mean,
that's why we're giggling over here. You never know.
It was 75 degrees today, right? That November 2nd. That's a little weird.
What about the vegetation response after, let's say, 2018 flood? They basically scoured everything out of the system. Was it recovered? I mean, that has to have
the aquatic vegetation or
aquatic vegetation.
Yeah. That is starting to come back. So I noticed a really pretty. So again, I should not give away my favorite places, but Ruland's Coulee. What I always liked about Ruland's Coulee is we always talked about it as the PhD stream because it would form, and I didn't use that photo, but it would form these big, areas like this, you can kind of just make out a little bit, but they'd have these massive wheat beds, these massive alluvial beds, and then there'd be just kind of a channel through there. Being a dry fly snob, I like that because you can't fish a nymph, and who wants to anyways? So I cast my dry fly along the edge of and fish will come off from under the weeds and hit it. And that is just kind of starting to come back. Now that they did the work in there, it's probably going to take another little bit of time for it to continue to recolonize. But the vegetation certainly got blown out hard in that 2018 flood, and it takes some time for that to recolonize. And it is a great refuge in the middle of summer. It provides great shade. It provides a lot of food, so there's a lot of insects that live on that, and scuds and stuff that live in that. So that in-stream vegetation in our spring creeks is a pretty important source of food and protection. So that is just kind of starting to come back. Good. Well, thank you guys for having me. I really had fun. It was great.